Welcome to Finding Passenger Lists from 1620 to the 1950s, Part 1. I'm Rhonda Hoffman. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. I work in the Grosvenor Room, which is the special collections department at the Central Library in downtown Buffalo. The Grosvenor Room includes genealogy, local history, maps, rare books, and music scores. We'd love to have you visit us once we reopen. In Part 1, we'll talk about background, history, and early passenger lists. Unfortunately, before 1820, there were no passenger list requirement for the United States, although ports, shipping companies, and archives may have kept lists. Surviving lists have been transcribed and published in various sources. Children's and wives were usually not listed for this time period, especially from the 1600s into the 1700s. The Grosvenor Room has a great passenger list guide, which includes the different sources to find passenger lists. To get to it, you go to the Grosvenor Room website and you click on Guides and Publications, and then Ethnic and Immigrant Genealogy. Next, click where it says Passenger Lists, and the lists are in order by date, earliest to most recent. And anything on this guide we have in the Grosvenor Room. This is an example from one of the sources that you'll find on our guide. It's a clip from Passenger and Immigration Lists Index. It's a very large book set. It covers from the 1500s up to present day. It does not include everything that's out there. What it does is it indexes books that index passenger lists. And what you see here to the left is a transcription to some of the information that was published in the book. So you'll see information like the person's name, their age, the place of arrival or other record of immigration, date of arrival or other record of immigration, a source code, which here is 206.7. You can see, and then there's the page number in the source. And to the right, in the beginning of the book, will be the source details. So that 206.7 means this book that we see on the right, Check Immigration Passenger Lists, Volume 9. And we could let you know in the Grosvenor Room if we have that other book. And if we don't have it, we could try to borrow it through Interlibrary Loan Services if you have a Buffalo and Erie County Public Library card. This is a screen from American Ancestors, which is the databases of the New England Historic Genealogical Society. We have this available for use in the Grosvenor Room. It's only available in-house in the Grosvenor Room through the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. And you can keyword search it, and you'll find excerpts from different books that are in the database. So here, the top search is John Barcroft, and you can see to the right it lists that he came on the ship James, and then you could click on that and you would see the particular details. In the example that we showed, it wasn't an actual passenger list where that data came from. It was from something called Licenses to Go Beyond the Seas of England, which cover in the 1630s into 1639. There is also some information from 1677. And what these lists will give are ships and general location of where the person is going. The date listed on these lists is the date of the oath that was needed to get a license, or the date of issuing the license. It's not when they actually arrived or left their country. Other types of examples where you might see early passenger data are lists of convicts or indentured servants bound to America. Libraries, archives, museums, and historical societies may hold any early surviving passenger lists before the U.S. government required them. One place that you can search the collections of those places is ARCHIVEGRID. It's a free website, and good search terms to put in are passenger lists, manifests, customs house, logbook, and the names of shipping lines. WorldCat, another free resource. It includes different library holdings for all over the U.S. as well as some foreign locations. That's another great free website that you can use to look for archival collections of passenger lists. Here's ARCHIVEGRID, and what I did is I searched for logbook, and you can see different ships listed here. I got over 6,000 different hits with that term in it, and you can see some early lists here. So even though the U.S. required passenger lists beginning in 1820, full compliance didn't occur until 1905. Here's an example passenger list that looks very similar to a census register, where you'll see data at the top, the data that's being collected, the different column headings, and then you'll see all of the information for each individual that traveled. Here are two sections from two different passenger lists. This is very typical of what you would see between 1820 and 1892. So the first one is from 1846. It's the bark Edinburgh. And it has that it came through the port of Cork, and that is going towards Boston. That information you can see at the top. Then you'll see the information for each person. So what we see here are their names, their ages, their gender, their occupation, the country which they belong to, that they're a citizen of, and then the country that they're going to. Towards the right, you see remarks relative to any who may have died or left the vessel during the voyage. So if someone passed away, you'll usually see a note, and it'll usually include the date and possibly the cause of the death. At the bottom, you see the same type of information. We see the ages in years. We see a gender. We see the profession, the country which they are citizens, their native country, the intended destination or location. This one includes the number of pieces of baggage that they came with. And it also includes what part of the ship they stayed on. So these folks were in a cabin. There's also a column for date and cause of death. That one is from 1890. This is a picture that depicts the steerage, and it's dated about 1891. The steerage is where most people traveled, where you have your living quarters, where you eat, where you socialize, all in the same place. So to the left of the picture, we see where there's kind of like bunks. And then over to the right, there are more bunks, and towards the close part of the picture to the right, you'll see a table where they would sit and eat. From 1893 forward, we find even better information. One of the most important pieces of information is the place of last legal residence, so you know where they're from in the foreign country. The port of embarkation, where they started their journey, their final destination, if they were ever in the U.S. before, where and when. If you're joining a relative, the name, address, and relationship to the relative. Their place of birth is noted beginning in 1906, and beginning in 1907, the name and address of the nearest relative in their home country. This is a passenger list from 1900. Here we see a woman named Sigrid Alto traveled on the Baltic, and she is 22 years age. She's a female. She's single. It says she's a servant. She's able to read and write. Her nationality is Finland. Her race is Finnish. The last permanent residence is in Saimaa in Finland. And the nearest relative in the country that she came from is her mother, Maria, who also lives in Saimaa. Her final destination is New York City. And one thing you want to remember when you're looking at passenger lists is there are often 2 pages to the records. So always, when you get a hit in the database and it brings you to a page, always look ahead 1 page and back 1 page, just in case, so you don't miss something. So here's the second page, and we see that her passage was paid by her sister, that she has about $28 on her, that she's never been in the U.S. before, that she's going to stay with her sister, and her sister's name is Alma Alto. It gives her specific address in New York City. It asks whether she's a polygamist, whether she's an anarchist. It asks about her health, mental and physical. It says good. And it says her physical description. So she's 5'2", has a light complexion, blonde hair, blue eyes. She has no marks of identification, so like things like a scar or a birthmark. And it says her place of birth is Saimaa in Finland. Unfortunately, some passenger lists didn't survive. But luckily, from 1820 through 1874, there were quarterly reports made that included copies of passenger lists. They were made for the Secretary of State by the collectors of customs at each location. These may be the only things that survived, and sometimes they didn't transcribe the full information, so it may only be partial data. This is the National Archives website. If you want to see a list of all the possible ports that people could have come in on and the dates of the lists that are available for research, go to this link. There are over 300 locations on this webpage. In the beginning, when people came to the U.S., there weren't many restrictions, but eventually there became immigration laws that restricted certain people from coming into the country. The first restrictions were in 1882. One example of a restriction, this is from 1891. This is a list of classes of persons denied the right to immigrate to the U.S. So people who were considered insane, paupers, people with contagious diseases, persons convicted of felonies or misdemeanors of moral turpitude, and polygamists. In 1921, that was when they first made immigrant quota restrictions. This picture depicts a health inspection. You can see that this inspector is inspecting the lady's eyes. If it was thought that someone trying to enter the country fell into one of those restricted categories, they would have been held aside for special inquiry. Unfortunately, these were very subjective. For example, for certain time periods, you wouldn't be allowed in if you had a poor physique, or for questions of moral turpitude. That could be something like if there was a woman who was unwed and pregnant, they could decide not to let her into the country. These people faced a special inquiry trial and investigations while they're being held for trial. Investigations may have been done while they were in Ellis Island custody. During the investigations, agents would interview passengers thoroughly and also interview other witnesses. And sometimes you might wonder, like, well, how did they find out certain people, certain information about people? Sometimes a U.S. resident may warn officials that someone was coming into the country that they didn't think should, because, say, for example, for moral turpitude. If they failed the trial, then they would be deported. This is an example where we see persons marked for special inquiry. Off to the left, you can see SI, And then there's a stamp that says admitted. So all of these folks faced a trial, but they were eventually admitted. If you see the SI notation on a list, look at the end of the list for the ship that they came in on. A special inquiry list may be included and the reason for being held may be stated. These you might find beginning in 1903. So on this list, we can see the cause of detention, which is the reason they were held back. And here, most of the people are women, and you'll see the cause of detention. You'll see something like to uncle, to brother, to sister. Women needed to wait for someone to pick them up. They weren't allowed to travel alone into the U.S. For their safety. So you'll also see their destination, which is often an address that they're going to with the person who's picking them up. And it will tell you how long they were there. You can tell how long they were detained by the number of meals, which is on the far right. Most people only might have had 1 or 2 meals, but you might notice that someone might have had to wait a few days for someone to come pick them up. If someone was rejected, if they weren't allowed into the country, they would be sent back at the cost of the shipping company. Sometimes the shipping company may have also had to pay a fine. So it was in the shipping company's best interest to check people out before they sent them on their journey, because this obviously they would have lost money because of this. Sometimes you might be able to find the file, the special inquiry trial file of your ancestor. Some of them survived for New York City and Philadelphia, and they're kept at the National Archives, but most of them are not indexed. That's the end of part 1. Come back for part 2, where we'll talk about preparing for your passenger list search and records that provide passenger list data. Thank you for joining us.